We have three sectors represented. We have academia, NGO, and government. First, let me introduce Mr. Frank DiGiovanni, known as D9. And he is, again, give me your title, it's forever long.
No, I'm the Deputy Chief of Naval Personnel. How's that? Do that one.
Okay, Deputy Chief of Staff of Navy for Personnel. We have Melanie Greenberg, who's CEO and President for Alliance for Peace Building, an NGO. That is a basket NGO that embraces all. And we have Matt Levinger, who is the professor at the Elliott School. And they're going to tell you how, they're going to have a conversation on why this is important, how it affects their sector, and how this vision came about. Sure.
So Beverly gave me no direction, which is really bad, right? So we are going to have a conversation, and I'll start it off asking kind of questions to my two partners here, and we'll go from there. So I'll ask both of you, why is this particular seminar important?
Well, first, thank you, Frank and Bev and Andrew, and to all of you for being here, to the Elliott School for hosting us and organizing this event. I'm here because I feel that narrative lies at the very heart of peace building. It's the DNA, for several reasons. First, if any of you have been involved in a peace building exercise, much of what you do is tell stories. And you might not call it that, but you're reflecting on your history, your perceptions of the conflict, of justice, your views of the other side, your dreams for the future. And even the institutions that we build in peace building are built on narrative. What kind of functions will it serve? What kinds of constituencies will it have? How will it change the course of the narrative in a society in conflict? So stories and narrative are at the heart of what we do. And we're also finding that it's not only something cultural, it's something in our brains. That our brains tell stories. It's how we make sense of the world, it's how we make meaning. And in peace building, we're really changing the very structure of our brains through the stories we tell and creating joint futures together. And in case any of you don't think this is important, we now know that trauma, cultural trauma, is not only passed down metaphorically, it's also passed on epigenetically. So these stories have a biological basis. But I also feel that there is a narrative we have to tell not only within our peace building, but about peace building. And how, working with partners across different sectors, do we change the story of why peace building is important and peace building is strategic. And so I feel that all of those come together in this seminar.
Okay.
Thanks, Melanie. Melanie is always a hard act to follow. So I'm Matt Levinger, and I direct the National Security Studies program at the Elliott School, which is a senior leader executive education program. And I also direct our mid-career master's program, the Master of International Policy and Practice program. Before I get started, let me just say I have been instructed to warmly welcome all of you on behalf of our Dean, Ambassador Ruben Brigidi, who is currently doing what deans do, namely raising money in Europe and also extending our relationships with our alumni and friends in Europe. Both of the programs that I run are distinctive in that they don't end with a thesis, but they begin with a thesis statement. And that thesis statement is that narrative is at the heart of leadership in international affairs. And the second part of that thesis, particularly for my National Security Studies program course, is that the United States in particular has been underperforming in its capacity to effectively tell stories about the world since the end of the Cold War, and most especially since 9/11. That we have tremendous material resources, but if we lose the thread of the narrative, if we can't tell a compelling story about where the world is today and where we would like to help it move, then we're unable to take full advantage of the enormous material resources and expertise that we have in our national security agencies. Effective leaders tell effective stories. We all know this intuitively. But in the discipline of international relations, there's until recently been little systematic attention to examining the question of what makes an effective story. The two dominant schools of international relations theory, realism and liberalism, tend to emphasize the material foundations of power and the institutional foundations of power, but only marginally the profound role that the construction of meaning plays in shaping our behavior in the world. I believe that narrative, as Melanie said, is at the very heart of how we make sense of the world, of how we act in the world. Personally, I started out as a scholar of nationalism. And fundamentally, nationalism is a grand storytelling exercise that has inspired tens of millions of people to die or kill on behalf of a community that's greater than themselves. The world is becoming ever more complex, ever more volatile, and for us to effectively move toward a more secure, prosperous, and peaceful world, we must begin with the act of thinking carefully about the stories that we're telling about the world. That's the mission of this conference, and that's why we at the Elliott School are so tremendously excited to be hosting it.
Frank, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I noticed that you have battleships and not Shakespeare on your tie. So perhaps you could tell us why you're interested in narrative from your perspective.
So, great, and I have both of you said some interesting things, which I want to pull the thread on here in a second. So why am I here? It's kind of interesting that there's a common thread between the three of us, an NGO, someone from the Defense Department, and academia. And it has to do with the power of story. I mean, in Vietnam War, what did we talk about? We talked about winning hearts and minds. You don't win hearts and minds with violence. You win hearts and minds by convincing people that your way of life is better than the one they're currently in. So telling that story is important from the Defense Department's perspective. How many of you are in the military, have been in the military? Now the next question I'm going to ask you is, how many of you really wanted to go to war? Not a hand in the room. Our job is to keep that from happening in the Defense Department. And if we can show people what our way of life is and who we are as a society, then we don't have to go do our job, which is a good thing. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you.
I'll ask, so there's a couple of questions that I have. Actually, you brought up something that I always like to pick on people about. So I have a question for the panel, and you guys can play along too. The question is the world more complex or not? You said it was, Matt.
Yeah.
Do you think it's more complex? It's a trick question.
Well, the world has always been complex, and I don't think anyone who lived through the Cold War, even when we had the bipolarity between the US and the Soviet Union, would say the world was simple. But I think one difference now is that no one has control of a narrative. You know, we don't have a news media which tells you at the end of every evening, and that's the way it was. That we know that power is devolving, that governments don't hold monolithic power, that we have different streams. But we do also live in a world where someone's narrative said it was okay to blow up a concert of young people.
Yeah.
And if that's not complexity, I don't know what is.
Yeah, I would echo what Melanie said about the multiplication of actors who can exercise authority or exercise power that previously would have been the province of states. And I also just think the growing interconnectedness of, ICT, information and communication technologies, just accelerate the pace of communication, and to that extent, I think in both those regards, there is increasing complexity.
Okay, so, anyone in the audience? How many think the world's more complex today than it was 50 years ago, so to say? Okay, so now,
Be brave.
you're sort of, yeah,
I don't know if the world is more complex, but everyone's perception of it is, because go back 100 years and the only views you knew were those few that dribbled in,
That's right.
that took months to get around the world, or those that were local. Now in a few moments, you can be aware of what's going on around the world, so you're aware of so many more actors than you used to be. If you're in a position of making decisions, that means you're concerned with many more actors than you used to be, so that the individual life is becoming more complex, whether or not the world is.
Yeah, so that's kind of, and I think my two partners up here kind of said the same thing. So I'm of the belief that the world has not gotten more complex. We just know more about it. We know more about it. I mean, how long would it have taken us to hear about what happened in England yesterday? 200 years ago. Long time. Some cases we may have never heard of it. The world, as you said, has always been complex. But now we have to think about things that happen on the other side of the world when 200 years ago we didn't have to, because we didn't know about it. That's why I pulled this thread on that one comment, and I think both perspectives are right, but it depends on how you frame the thought. The next question I have, and Matt brought this up, is, and then I'm going to go to the DNA question, the DNA thing you talked about, is, so I'm going to ask both of y'all, and of course I'll make a comment too. Why do you think the U.S. is underperforming in its world narrative? Matt?
In short, I think we're underperforming because if you look at human behavior in general, my judgment is that we're motivated principally by threats and rewards, by fear and the prospect of something better. And I feel that we have become, and you need both. Simply going for a reward leads to, not as much motivation as being immediately confronted by something that has the potential to kill you. There's no doubt about it that fear is highly motivating, but it's also paralyzing, and it leads to lower capacity to be creative, to collaborate, to use your cognitive capacity effectively. And I think particularly since 9/11, our foreign policy discourse has been so focused on protecting ourselves from overwhelming threats that we've lost the capacity to collaborate as effectively as we need to in order to address world problems today.
I agree with Matt said, and also feel that we've lost the desire to press on the core values of what make us American. And we worked so hard after the World War II to set up institutions and values, the Geneva Conventions, all of the post-Cold War or the post-war institutions around human rights. And so we're able to, to look at gas attacks in Syria and not take strong action, or military hospital convoys being bombed. So I feel that American narrative around rights, around democratic principles, we just have not been pushing hard enough, and I think it's really taken away the luster of our leadership in the world.
Yeah, I kind of agree with both of you on that, and I'll speak to this in my Ignite talk a bit, so I don't want to spill too much of what I'm going to talk about. But I do think there's a sense of isolationism in the U.S. So I'm not sure we're underperforming it. I think it's more like we don't want to. We don't want to. It's not that we don't have the capacity to do it, but I think, you know, we just want to be left alone, I guess. That's what it seems like to me. Hadn't really thought much about it, but are there any comments on that issue?
Well, I think there is a sense of isolationism. I think it does come from fear. I think it comes from not being strategic. I think Chris Holschek and I talk a lot about peace building as strategy, and that we tend to be tactical rather than having a defining strategy. And when we're working in a world where other countries like China and even Russia in its own way have strategies for engagement in the world, we lose. But I also feel that other countries are looking to us. I was in Colombia last week meeting with a group of peace builders when President Santos was meeting with President Trump. And the whole country was looking to this meeting for an American affirmation of the importance of the peace process there. And President Trump only talked about Venezuela. And when a reporter said, hey, peace process in Colombia, oh yeah, best peace process ever, great. So, you know, what does that say when we're not even supporting the efforts for peace around the world that other people are doing, and which we had a great part in that history?
You know, strategy has to do with applying ways and means to achieve ends, and so if we look at, you know, effective strategy, it starts with a clear and measurable goal. So if President Kennedy says we will put a man on the moon and bring him safely back to Earth by the end of this decade, that's a pretty clear goal. Or if FDR says in 1943, our goal is to defeat German and Japanese war power, and toward that end, we seek the unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Again, you know whether or not you've achieved those goals. If you say, we are going to win the war on drugs, you know, we've been doing that for 32 years now, right? Likewise, we will win the war on terror. It seems to me that's pretty hard to measure. And if you can't define what victory looks like, it's impossible to win.
So I think I've been given the hook here, but I do want to throw out one more provocative thought. So there's an author, his name is James Carse, and he wrote a book called Infinite Games and Finite Games. Anybody heard of that book? So what Matt just described is an infinite game. There is no winning the war on drugs. You'll never win it. You'll never win it. Because it's an infinite game. The same with the folks that were fighting in the Middle East. It's an ideology. Ideologies don't die. You'll never win that. And so you have to use the right strategy when it comes to, and this is why the narrative is important, you have to use the right strategy for the game you're playing. A finite game is one where, you know, it's a baseball game. Both teams decide that you're going to play 9 innings, and at the end of 9 innings you're going to declare a winner because one team has more runs than the other. In an infinite game, the objective of the game is to keep it going. Think about the narrative. Think about the people, the ideology that we're fighting against. And then think about what game are they playing, finite or infinite. And if the objective is to keep the game going, you'll never be able to declare victory. They'll win every time. A finite strategy will lose every time to an infinite game strategy. So I'll leave you with that thought, and my thanks to the panel. This was awesome.